Right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to a wonderful and exciting lecture that we've got lined up for you titled African Innovation. Just to let you a bit more about the program is titled New Politics and Afrofuturisms, which is calling for Black radical imagination and popular culture as powerful vehicles for propelling progressive social justice narratives to mainstream audiences with a focus on Afrofuturism, Black activism, arts and culture, along with political theory and practice. And for those of you not familiar with the University of the Underground, it is a free, pluralistic, and transnational university based in the basement of nightclubs in Amsterdam. But as you can tell, due to the recent global events, the program is online. Just to tell you about a bit of a bio on our wonderful educator, lecturer, all things. And her name is Dr. Tegan Bristow. And she's the director of the Fak'ugesi African Digital Innovation Festival since 2016. She's a senior lecturer in interactive digital media at the Wits University of the Arts with a specialization on African art, culture, and technology. Editor-in-chief and digital editor of the Ellipses Journal for Creative Research. And Dr. Bristow is also additionally a developer of interactive digital media in installation, performance, screen-based, and online media. This is just a very, very brief introduction to someone who really talented with some amazing work. And Tegan, we are really honored for you to be joining us today just to kind of share your wisdom and your thoughts and teach us today. So thank you so much for taking the time out today. And yeah, I'll give the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm nice to be here and to meet all of you. And from what I saw in the program, I'm at the end of a really long list of really extraordinary speakers that you would have had contact with over time. I'm also, just to tell you that I'm in a public space, not a public space, I'm in a co-working space in Johannesburg. So if you see people walking past or someone talking, please, please forgive me. And I'm not going to use headphones because after a while, they just kind of bother me. So I'm not gonna wear them. Um, so Christopher has asked me to speak about African innovation, which is obviously like a whole subject matter that like thousands of people can talk about in different kinds of ways. I'm specifically going to be talking about African innovation from the perspective of culture and technology, because that's what I do. And as Magic said, I'm a director of a festival called the Fak'ugesi African Digital Innovation Festival. But actually, it's an arts and culture and technology festival. So I thought, let me just like kick off by showing you like a little short video of Fak'ugesi that we made last year. The festival has been going since 2014, and we started it because there was literally no practice or support or platform uh, for the for digital art practice, basically, and digital crossovers between technology, culture, and art on the continent. At the time in 2014, there was a lot of focus on innovation, like innovation, which is this very, very scary term, and mobile phones, because mobile phones were going to change the whole world. Like everybody in Africa was suddenly going to get access as soon as they had a mobile phone. So this was a very interesting location to kind of kick off from. Um, and you can kind of look at the history of the festival from our website. Let me just drop it in here, fakugesi.co.za, and we have an about section which kind of shows a really nice history of where we came from and what we did over these last few years. I'm going to drop it in here, and the timeline kind of explores a number of themes that we explored over the years. The first one was Rise Digital Africa. So we were kind of trying to align the cultural movement with the technology and innovation movement in 2015. The second one was Afro Tech Riot. So this was at a time, because we work with the university, when the student uprising was like really big in South Africa. I don't know how many of you've heard of the Fees Must Fall movement, which was really like a rising of young professionals and students in the country, basically complaining about the fact that they had no access and were not supported by government in any capacity. Um, And yes, so on and so forth. So last year, our theme was own your force, because we felt like we'd done a kind of roundabout loop from someone is joining me here. I wonder who it is.
Yeah, okay, we have to think about new filter and gatekeeping structures that take a totally new shape. Yeah, however, I mean, it's again, I would say it's also a question of the classic mass media of how to deal with, with.
Hello?
Hi, sorry, I wasn't sure who that was.
I think that's somebody need, if everyone can just mute themselves, that'd be great. Yeah, it's all right. It's all right, Zhaoji. Yeah, it's all done. Apology. Over back to you and Dr. Tegan.
No, okay, no problem. And I was kind of rambling a bit, talking a little bit about the history of the festival and how it went. And now we're at this time where we're called Own Your Force. So it's really about taking all that movement around innovation and the focus on innovation on the continent, and kind of saying, how do we as content producers, or how do content producers on the continent actually own that in different kinds of ways? So the shift has become dramatically about publication, about ownership within that space. So the video I'm going to show you is from that year. Let me do a quick screen share. There we go. And let me just run this in full screen. I hope you can hear. Why don't you just tell me if the sound works?
Yep, it works.
It's inevitable to be third world when your name has been extracted from your tongue and its gravitas unearthed from your mind. With fragments in our hands, attempted recreating beauties lost to the sleeping moon. Africa, you are the essence of innovation and origin of civilization.
So the Fak'ugesi Festival is all about digital art, digital innovation, looking at really cool projects and displaying them and showcasing all of the talent that South Africa and other African countries have to offer.
It's a meeting place for content creators, technologists, VR enthusiasts. Fak'ugesi is the springboard of revival in Africa.
I feel like this is a good place to come and meet people, network, see amazing work, be inspired, plot and scheme, and also learn basic technical things from people that know a bit better.
Glad Now is forcing me to interact with people and to see how their knowledge and their skills can contribute to my work and how I can also help in that exchange.
I think Fak'ugesi is playing a huge and important role in being the renaissance of change in Africa.
Africa, set your own table before the world. Take it with your own systems. Feast on your force to drape descendants with a power. Not all that is foreign is greater than your own. Hone your force. Own your ish.
Okay, so I think that gives you a good idea of what the festival is about, and how, you know, what it's led to. But basically, in this time between 2014 and now, it's like quite a lot of work to develop it. And I also started the festival off the back of research that I was producing in 2014 and 2015 in my PhD, because I was teaching at Wits University, which I still do, and I've been teaching interactive media and culture and technology, but there was basically a non-existent African curriculum. Like all the work that we were presenting were European histories, philosophies, theories, American histories and philosophies and theories, and there was no link to how South Africans, other Africans were actually using technology, the histories of those technologies associated to their work. So basically in 2013, I began this research project called Post-African Futures. And there's often people read that wrong. And so it's like post African futures rather than post-African futures, right? So it's not a like a post-African format, it's like a post-futures format. So what happens past this particular event called Afrofuturism and African futures, and what are the consequences of it? And a lot of that questioning was really around like who was making it, like where was African futurism coming from, or Afrofuturism specifically. Because at the time there was like a lot of labeling going on and a lot of local practitioners and makers were just being like, I don't know where this came from, but suddenly I'm an Afrofuturist, so this is great. It lets me sell more work, brilliant, but I don't know why. And I think that kind of generalization of that space started kind of looking at a question of how exactly you know, what exactly was missing in that generalization? What was missing about the context, about the spaces? You know, what was happening in Uganda? What was happening in Johannesburg? How were these different? Were the closeness of those things really being addressed or not? So I'm going to show you like a very old presentation around post-African futures that kind of explores some of the kind of history and philosophies of technology within that encounter, sort of pre-colonial, colonial questions that kind of led us to how we're thinking today. I'm also going to do another share, and I'm going to try and find, oh yeah, there we go. Is this the right one? Yeah, it is. Okay. I'm going to go right back. So I'm also going to just read a little bit because I haven't presented this in a long time. So you'll have to excuse me, I'm really sorry. I haven't presented it in a long time. So this is like an interesting moment for me to like represent some of the stuff. But basically and please stop me at any time to ask questions. I probably won't be having a close look at the chat, so you might just have to interject. There's a small enough group of you. So the end up title of this was Decoloniality and Actual Methodologies in Art and Cultural Practice in African Cultures of Technology. And basically what I'm presenting to you today is published in this book called African Futures, which was produced by Goethe Institute in 2015 and 2016, and is also extracted from my PhD dissertation. If you haven't seen this book before, please try and get hold of it. It's really interesting and has many voices in it, which is really fascinating. So I'm going to kind of start by looking at the question of African cultures of technology and kind of going from there. And the premise of where this comes from is, you know, over the last couple, I've been kind of exploring where is African technology? Like how do we define African technology that's, you know, beyond Afrofuturism or the questions of Afrofuturism? And you know, as can be expected, the research led me down like various wonderful paths, but the kind of adage of one cannot look to the future without looking at the past is true. So it was really important to understand contemporary practice by looking very heavily into the past. So the future cannot be predicted, but is equal to the possibilities of change. Change is a creative force, but for change to occur, one must first understand the position from which you are changing. So this is kind of like the position which I picked up and sort of said, okay, where are we changing from? Where are we developing this innovation from? What is unique to the continent, and how we and other people work within the space? And the sort of first area of entry for me was self-organizing systems. So the notion of a lot of pre-colonial, a lot of literature that I found around like African technology pre-colonially or colonially was basically extraordinarily lacking. You know, I was disappointed to find that most of what exists in written research is either archaeological, anthropological, or within anthropologically led African art history, all of which, apart from being written from Euro-American perspectives, was dominantly empirical and largely non-theoretical. So there was just very little to actually draw from and look at from an academic perspective. In historical archaeology and anthropology, subjects ranged from a large selection of writing on like metal smelting, you know, like, oh wow, technological innovation in Africa, metal smelting. And that's about as far as it went. There was also a lot of research around addressing the role of broadcast media, specifically radio, during the times of insurrection. but it was unfortunately written from the perspective of appropriation rather than a kind of insurrectionary knowledge format, which is a bit frustrating. But there was very little work around what are the philosophical positions of pre-colonial Africa or colonial Africa. And really that's when I started kind of drilling down into trying to understand what those histories were and where knowledge existed and where it could exist and where it still exists in different kinds of ways. And one of the first things I did was pick up on pre-colonial technological and mathematical systems. This is really, really well known now, but and I've used it so much more in my teaching as we've gone on. But basically looking at pre-colonial mathematics and everything. So these are some of the books that I explored: so African mathematics, From Bones to Computers, African Fractals, which is a work that I keep coming back to by Ron Eglash, which basically looks at sort of cultural architecture, craft, clothing, all kinds of things that exist as cultural artifacts and artworks within people's homes, and how they then hold within them knowledges, technological knowledges, mathematics, really complex systems within them. So this is really interesting because it also goes on into spirituality, it goes on into other kinds of knowledge formats which are more egalitarian rather than material, and this was very fascinating for me. And then following that, there was this question of how do we renegotiate traditional knowledge within the contemporary space? And one of the places that sort of led me here in a sort of roundabout way was this book, also in the African mathematics format, called Living Mathematics: Drawings from Angola, which addressed the Uralian paths by the Luanda Chokwe people. And basically they're sort of complex algorithms that are performed algorithms that are used through age grading. But what happened from this was I came across a text by Delinda Collier, From Hut to Monitor: The Electrification of the Chokwe War Murals. And she really began like quite a heavy critique on that particular work and why the sort of Angola and Luanda situation brought with it a lot of really interesting questions. So in this paper, Collier looks at the documented history of the Lusona and revisits the Portuguese anthropologist José Redina, who kind of wrote about it. And Collier deals with him in particular and his interpretation of the drawings, which he calls wall drawings, for the primary reason that this was the only static form of the drawings that he saw. He didn't understand that they were part of a performance or part of an age grading process. And he basically identified them as that and kept them as that in his documentation. So they're understood as drawings and not as performances. And he was basically an anthropologist who was hired by the company Demang, which was mining diamonds in Angola. And she writes, in 1957, the company Demang completed a hydroelectric dam in northern eastern Angola in the Lunda northern province. Demang was a mammoth diamond extraction company in Angola during the zenith of the Portuguese colonial rule. It was a state within a state with its own police force, radio station, museum, health service, and agriculture. 80% of Demang's workforce were in the Luanda region and were of the ethnic Chokwe group, a once powerful state that was defeated as the Portuguese made the final push into the interior of the massive colony. Collier first explores the position of this anthropologist and then begins to talk about the sort of scientific colonialism performed by Demang, the company, through this anthropologist and through what was made called a living museum of Chokwe culture. She states, the colonial situation, the abstraction of information that developed with mediation is inextricably bound up with the extraction of materials such as diamonds, achieved as it was most often through coerced labor and societal violence. Collier explores how at the time the mechanisms for recording anthropological research, namely audio recording, documented film, and what were called living museums were offered as real presentations of these cultures. and the realness, she states, was supported by the assumed logic of the media used to document the cultures. So the conditions, she states, let me just move it on here. The conditions that Demang established were conterminous with the electrification of production and the ephemeralization of information. In the case of colonialism in Africa, the ghosting of indigenous media practices was not an unfortunate consequence of colonial rule, as most scholars of the time understood, but rather an intentional divestment of indigenous populations of power by participation. Okay, so this is basically the history in which we try and build a history of technology and innovation on the continent. And I think this is a part of the history that was really excluded largely, and within the sort of innovation section of this history, which really looked at, the need for innovation based on the lack of access, for instance, innovation because of having little and therefore being able to innovate a lot with different kinds of outputs. So I was really kind of felt it was very important to build in the kind of divestment essentially of cultures and knowledge through colonialism, and how that in itself begins to talk about a history of technology on its own. And what's that Argentinian sociologist called? Anyway, he talks about coloniality, modernity as one single encounter. And if we look at the history of technology, African technology through that lens, then we're speaking about a lot of stuff. But in that, there was also like a shift in how do we start talking about like the philosophy of technology? How do we start encountering what other kinds of philosophies of technology could exist that may have been prevalent and existent in the African continent prior to colonialism, and how do we bring those to the fore? And really the shift there, and I'm not going to go in very heavily into it, but the shift there was basically looking at how we needed to look at technology as a social cultural system, where the Western format with technology is really the implication to like separate that, so to keep the sort of material format of technology on one side, and to keep the construction of that on the other side, so the societies that make them, the choices that are developed, and by whom and where. So I began sort of unpacking the question of the philosophies of technology. And this paper, Fetished Objects and Humanized Nature Towards an Anthropology of Technology by Pfaffenberger, was really significant to me because, and he states, what is so striking about both naive views of technology, the view that emphasizes the disembodied ways of making and doing, technological somnambulism, which is basically a sleepwalking, and the other that asserts technology's autonomy, technological determinism, is that they are both gravely understated or disguise the social relations of technology. So these two principles, technological somnambulism and technological determinism, are essentially the Western format for philosophies of technology that basically separate out the social consequences or the social determinism essentially of technology. Yeah, so the question then I began sort of unpacking those principles of technology, those philosophies of technology, and started sort of positioning the potential for what could be a more egalitarian format. So how in sort of the African format, when you look at the pre-colonial work that we saw previously with Eglash and the mathematical formats, which were dynamically part of a social system and not separated from a social system, so therefore much more egalitarian, what would a different philosophy of technology be were it to originate from the continent and at that time, had it not been divested by colonialism? So that was the question that I was asking in this. And also why at the time, and I'm just going to switch out a little bit. Just give me a second here. I started exploring the question of post-African futures, because the futures, African futures and African futurism were like deeply wrapped into a kind of Western position on technology, and the questions of insurrection, the questions of a kind of rebellion as a knowledge format weren't being discussed either. So there was the knowledge format that was egalitarian, so of people and of society, and then there was the knowledge format of insurrection. So where does knowledge actually sit, and does it have to sit within those defined kind of Western formats? And if not, how do we bring questions of insurrection and egalitarianism into a philosophy of technology? That's basically what I was asking there. Yeah. I think I'm underprepared. But basically, at that time, I then worked on an exhibition called Post-African Futures. And let me just share this again in 2015 with a number of artists who I had been working with in this research. So the research really expanded a large part of the continent. I'd worked with many, many different artists at the time, and basically asked them all of these questions, like what are the questions that need to happen as a practicing creative technologist or an artist working in technology? What are the questions that you're asking about innovation and about these things? So you can download this catalog if you want. I mean, the work is quite old. It's from 2015, but it really brings together the visions of a number of different artists in different ways to unpack and discuss what their positions are. So, for instance, Tabitha Rezaia, who has gone on to be a very well-established artist now, basically did a voice message apology from the West, sort of looking at the fact that the West itself needed to make an apology for the current systems of technology. Coming Soon, Change Initiated by Cuss Group, Joburg-based, made a billboard in which they kind of really spoke to the consequence of technology and marketing and capitalist consumerism and the innovation that happens there. A nervous conditioner, Life.0.1 Bind 2, which is Khosi Sekukeni, Nolan Dennis, and Tabitha Razia, basically were making a server designed specifically to be off the internet and specifically for Black culture that couldn't be intersected or interfaced or criticized by anyone else. Disruptor X, the project Notes from the Ancients, was a beautiful work by Pamela Fatsima-Sindstrom and Tenjin Kosi, which was a fantasy, science fiction performance fantasy about a disruptor, basically, and sort of speaks about that notion of insurrection and disruption and the role of that within a kind of futurist technology space. Where the Sphere Deviates to the Right, Migration or Mutation, is a very beautiful work by Janum Kendi Nkantebe, who's a sort of savant sculptor who works in paper and electronics, and he was basically building a system which he sort of saw where he tried to solve the problem of migration, saying that Africans had spent more time in the world because they were in the middle of the earth, and therefore the rotations are longer because it's thicker, and that Europeans were spending less time in the world, and that's why they rushed so much. And that migration was just natural because people had to spend time sharing. The Europeans needed to come to the center to spend more time in the world, and Africans needed to go to the poles to spend less time in the world. So they were incredibly beautiful unpackings of culture, of capitalism, of technology, and where they all intersect in different kinds of ways. Yeah, I mean, I could just speak about these for days, and yeah, but I'll leave it there. The other thing, like I said, I'm like largely unprepared for this, and I'm really talking about work that I did a long time ago, and has kind of evolved into so much of my practice and so much of how I work. So the festival, for instance, is is like fundamental to actually seeing that manifest in the real world and not just in a library somewhere at the university, and like supporting, platforming, making that work real in a lot of different ways. And one of the projects that I'm working on now is called Vocabulary for Vernacular Algorithms, which I'll be presenting in France next year as a school for vernacular algorithms. And I'm just going to open up a presentation a little bit about this project, and then I'll probably end, and then we can have a discussion. Let me see, where am I? Share again. This one. Okay. So this was a project that I developed with a number of people. So it premises on a lot of this early work. And it was a project that I started at the Wits Art Museum and with my students at the university, essentially, where I was teaching Ron English's work on mathematics and beadwork and cultural artifacts. And I would work every year with a group of students, engineering and game design and digital art students, and take them into the museum, which has a huge collection of African artworks, obviously like really difficult. I think any archive of African artworks is difficult because museum collections, how they're collected, whom they're collected by, just make things really, really not okay. And it was really a question of looking at those archives, but not through the perspective of African art history as written by sort of African, Western, European, African art historians, but really looking at that through the perspective of mathematics specifically, and sort of beginning to unpack the mathematical knowledge that exists within them. So we would go into the museum, and basically the students would choose objects, and they would then look at them through fractal mathematics, you know, in relation to Eglash's book. So scaling, recursion, numerical systems, complexity, infinity, and geometric algorithms. And it was really, really, really exciting to see what students brought from that, and how they began to bring together the worlds of spirituality with mathematics, and beginning to understand the link between what essentially like technical knowledge and other kinds of knowledge, like human knowledges and spiritual knowledges. So this is an example of one student group who basically were looking at spirituality and infinity in Venda culture, and the link between infinity and divination. And they chose these two objects, which both show infinity in them. So this is a medicinal horn used by a healer, and this is also a staff used by a healer, which has infinity into it. And Venda culture on its own is really complex and works with water, logarithmic spirals, biomimicry, to basically look at the extension of life in different kinds of ways. And it's deeply embedded in a cultural knowledge system, which is also you know, has other kinds of mathematical and technical knowledges within it. This is one of my favorites, is geometric algorithms, also another group. Interestingly, I'm working with Fiwe on a new project now, a few years later. But geometric algorithms are basically you know, as we know, geometry within three-dimensional space. But these baskets, of the Baluba baskets, basically are like a beautiful, beautiful example of that the students picked up really quickly. And it will move from a square to a circle to a triangle in one object, so mathematically really complex, but also speaks to spirituality. So for Baluba, it was a shift in life, like as you grow, so you change, and it was representational of that in different kinds of ways. They're also just really beautiful. So from this, I became really, really interested in mathematics and beadwork specifically, and I started this project called Vernacular Algorithms, and started it in a museum in Durban, in KZN, which is the KwaZulu-Natal, which has an enormous collection of Zulu and Xhosa beadwork. And I went there with a partner in crime, Russell Thongwane, who is of Zulu origin, and I think felt that there was a language, like a vocabulary that could be unpacked the same way as you would unpack a technical language like a mathematics. And kind of when we went there, we found something much deeper and much more complex. You know, apart from sort of very common approaches. So for instance, this is like the approach of royalty. There's a very specific Zulu royalty pattern, which is a lot of triangles, very specific colors, versus the Masinga area, which is a lot more organic and like draws from nature in different kinds of ways and relationships. But really, what we started seeing is that we needed to find a way to bring together the very complex geometry and the very complex mathematics in them with its symbolic encounter. And that's what beadwork does. It has in it relationships, it has in it histories of love, histories of families, histories of years of culture. It has nature in it, it has reflections of time, it has reflections of history. And you need to kind of bring these things together in order to really understand what the vernacular algorithm is. And then it's not just a mathematical algorithm, it's a huge, complex cultural algorithm at the same time. So we started asking, you know, how do we conflate the geometric with an experiential and symbolic encounter? Is this through a philosophy of culture? Is it through an algorithmic engagement? How do we present the personal, the hacked material form, and the environmental encounter in an algorithm? How do we develop a curriculum for this? How do we teach this in schools? You know, in a school that's basically built off the British system, where you teach technology and you teach culture separately. So this is a project that I'm working on now, and I'm working with an extraordinary beadworker called Felisi Wedube and a performer, Nhlanhla Mutlangu, and we will be running a school for vernacular algorithms in April next year in France, to sort of unpack and understand this more. And this is where I am, and I want to stop talking now because I think I've run out of things to say.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tegan. That was absolutely amazing. And guys, who wants to ask any questions? Let's just kind of open it up. Feel free to take yourself off mute. Someone, and Chloe asks, where's the school in France that you're going to be doing this in?
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm just looking at the comments now. So it's actually part of the Africa 2020 program, which was meant to run now in November. They postponed it to April. It will be in Nantes at a place called Les Unique. And it's part of an exhibition that's been curated by someone called Olimata Gay. Does that answer your question?
Just a quick question for myself. You know, the artists that you work with at the festival, are you finding that they are starting to get exhibited in the UK and in other places and in Europe at all?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. So in your the biographies of this particular session, there are at least 3 people in there who've worked with us before. So it's really exciting. So Hakim Adam was one of them. And he's obviously now studying in the UK, not in the UK, in Germany. Bizarrely, Christopher, who's obviously from the UK, was also part of our program in 2017. But yes, we're seeing a lot more of that. So this year, for instance, we had a kind of resident augmented reality artist, Zofa Wallace, who'd never made augmented reality before lockdown. So this was his first year he'd ever made it. And it was basically, he's invited to produce an exhibition for Grand Palais next year in France. And he's too overwhelmed to even answer at this point. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of opportunities. And, you know, going online this year was also a really big move for us. We were very aware of the kind of visibility that our artists would get. And it worked. Like we worked really hard to make sure that they were visible by other festivals, by other people on the continent who are running arts institutions. Yeah.
You know, and sometimes I come across some African artists that don't like to be called an African artist, just want to be called an artist and not necessarily pigeonholed to an African artist. Where I guess sometimes in the industry they can just they'll say, where anybody else saying you might be like, oh, this is an artist, this is whatever, but they'll say, oh, it's an African artist. In terms of your experience working with African artists, is that a bit of an issue, or is that a non-issue kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. You know, it's the same as like Afrofuturism, which began to like really generalize what people were actually making the work about. Because it goes Afrofuturists put it in that box, African artists put it in that box, but and it like ignores the facts, all the questions and the content that those artists are actually looking at and dealing with. From our perspective, from Fak'ugesi, we are specifically making ourselves a African Digital Arts Festival. So the African label is really important, and it's about bringing visibility to makers and creators on the continent. Yeah.
Brilliant. And April, do you want to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could reshare the reference about the geometry and the weaving of the baskets. I didn't get a chance to write it down.
Okay. Sure, no problem. I actually haven't added it. So did I can send the PDF that I made directly to you, to the group. I haven't actually sent anything to Christopher for the reference folder because I was deep inside of the festival when they invited me and I didn't read the email. So but the reference of the baskets were Baluba, Aluba. But let me rather just see if I can send this PDF to your group. Would that be better?
Or you can send it. You can send the PDF to Chris, and then we can share it via email.
Okay, cool. Great.
Iris asks, would you be able to share this event? Iris, are you talking about the event in France?
Yes, if you were able to share maybe the event, there's some of us that are in Europe, but that maybe can get together to go and visit. That would be amazing.
Sure. I'm not sure how much has been published at the moment because they had to change it because of COVID. So it was meant to be now, but it's part of the Africa 2020 season. And I'm just going to drop the season website into the chat. And I think as soon as they have more information, they'll start publishing there. Yeah, everything is very tentative at the moment. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Has anybody got any other questions at all? In that case, just wanted to say a massive thank you to Dr. Tegan Bristow. Really appreciate you taking some time out to kind of share your wisdom and everything. So yeah, massive love, and let's give her a massive round of applause. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'm sorry that I haven't been able to connect more or know more, but I will go and watch all more of the videos of people who've been presenting.
No, you've been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. Well, happy Friday, everybody. Enjoy.